Welcome to a presentation on the politics and policy of cross-boundary collaboration. This presentation is based on a report on a pilot study conducted for Northeastern University and a doctorate in law and policy program. I'd like you to think first about a worst-case outcome that comes from organizations not being able to collaborate across boundaries. This example is from 2008, and U.S. Marshals found 4 children slain by their mother in a Washington, D.C. apartment. An analysis of what happened found that there were multiple organizations, government and nonprofit organizations working with the family, but none of them shared information across boundaries to see signs of the impending danger. So this tragic case is rare, yet it illustrates the severe challenges that happen in society today. We have complicated problems that reach across traditional organizational boundaries and that require leaders to think about how do we work through our silos to enable a better and more concerted response. This also raises some really critical questions for government. Why is it so difficult for us to work across our boundaries? How can we as leaders address the barriers and enablers of cross-boundary operating models? And what does the future look like in a cross-boundary world? How do we get there? So if we look a bit at the history of this, we're coming from a long line of decisions that have moved us to the silo-based world that we're currently in. Clear organizational divisions have been a hallmark of good management for a long time. The configuration of firms over time became based on transaction cost logic framed by the Nobel laureate Ronald Coase, looking at how firms exist. And we also have a lot of social and cultural and market forces that have cemented the silo-based business model over time. So this history has been really strong in making us work in silos instead of collaborating across boundaries. But there are some new things happening in this world. Management research has enabled much better understanding of how we can put things together, essentially. How can organizational tasks be decomposed and distributed across organizational lines? We also have a whole new wave of information and communication technologies, network-enabled business models that are dramatically changing the transaction costs associated with working across boundaries. And lastly, there's a big push right now for leaders to think about how do we work across boundaries, because the biggest challenges we face in this world, everything from workforce development to climate change to justice and equity, revolve around cross-boundary approaches. So the market and social forces will change this environment a bit over time. So the pilot study that I worked on was really looking at the dynamics of working across boundaries. And there were 3 central questions that the research was looking to explore. The first was really the phenomena of what's happening. So how are leaders thinking about and responding to ideas on organizational boundaries? If they are thinking about it, how are they designing boundaries? So if they can choose the design, how are they doing it? How are they looking at the strategies for it? How are they moving forward? And 3 was to look at the law and policy environment. A lot of examples out there have situations where collaboration across boundaries can happen technically, but they're prohibited by legislative issues or jurisdictional boundaries or regulations or rules, whatever it may be, either real or perceived, that hinder progress across boundaries. So these are the 3 big questions that this initial research pilot was looking at. So the method behind this research was, again, looking at the phenomenological dynamics associated with cross-boundary collaboration. But to get there, I wanted to use some grounded theory approach. So more or less looking to work with current practitioners, to interview them, to better understand how they're thinking about this cross-boundary world, and then to catalog and code the experience of the practitioners so that some insights and information can bubble up from that, from those research findings. So this initial assessment and interview process yielded 3 core categories of findings. The first one was what the drivers of boundary change are. So what were these leaders thinking about when looking at changing boundaries? The second major category was around enablers and barriers in the operating environment, what helps them or hinders them in moving forward. And the third was around methods for changing boundaries. So if they do decide to move forward, how are they approaching it? How are they thinking about it? And what tactics and strategies are they putting in place to move forward? So the first one, the drivers of boundary change, I guess you could chunk these into kind of two buckets. There were some external ones and internal ones, and these were the most prevalent in the interviews. On the external side, the pressure coming from the outside, I suppose you could say, is the outcomes focus. A lot of leaders today are feeling the need, being pushed by stakeholders to drive more outcomes, more impact for the investment the public is putting in. The second, and closely related, is mission realignment. How are they getting to these outcomes? Is the mission pushing them there? And is the organization underneath that being designed in a way that we can reach those mission and outcome goals? As one interviewee put it, the central question is, are we affecting the change we're striving for? If we are, then great, but if we're not, then how do we change the organizational boundaries to get there? There's also the second bucket of internal drivers. So there's a lot of discussion from these leaders on driving efficiency, driving more effectiveness, and simplifying organizations in order to get a better return on investment or value, public value to taxpayers. The second major finding was around the enablers and barriers to cross-boundary collaboration. So the enablers were pretty clear. Again, a lot of stakeholder pressure to do this. Adoption of best practice. You're seeing a lot of movement in private industry around collaboration across boundaries. The information and technology environment can enable this collaboration in ways that it hasn't been able to before. And then as both an enabler and a barrier are measures. So in some ways we can measure organizations right now and see how they're underperforming because they're not collaborating. But this can also be a barrier in a way because as they're looking to drive more collaboration across boundaries, the question then is raised on, well, how do you measure that collaboration across those boundaries, and what's the value for doing it relative to doing nothing at all? So on the barrier side, a lot of legislative and legal issues, mostly around privacy and accountability. If we're setting up organizations to produce some type of an output and outcome, how do we then make them accountable? And that becomes a little tougher when they're working across boundaries. There's a lot of institutional resistance happening out there. People just, don't want to do this kind of work. And perception of shuffling boxes, meaning that if leaders change organizational boundaries, or the outcome such from that people will view it as valuable rather than just saying that leader changed positions and titles and moved some boxes around to try and change something. So the perception is a big issue. And then there are a number of adaptive issues, just long-held social, psychological, organizational psychology issues that can hinder moving forward in cross-boundary collaboration. And finding 3 was around methods for changing boundaries. So there's kind of 2 major areas here that these leaders talked about. The first was, if they can accomplish this, essentially looking at the organizations and saying, can we move across boundaries to collaborate together? Then they can move forward, and they can take some legislative action to do that. They can really push through executive sponsors, top-down management to change boundaries. But it's a lot of work. The second category is to bridge the boundaries. So if they deem that it's too difficult to move forward with cross-boundary collaboration and to really change the organizational boundaries in a concrete way, what they can do is bridge those boundaries. So the boundaries essentially stay in place, but we add in a layer of governance and process to share information and tactics and strategies across these boundaries to coordinate, I suppose you could say. And that requires a lot of negotiation around accountability, roles, and structure. So this is an important finding because leaders, as we've seen, will look at this in 2 ways. They can either change the boundaries or they can bridge them. So the takeaways really are there's a fundamental change happening. We need to catch up with management strategy and law and policy. And there's a need for further research to gain knowledge and insights on how we can move these ideas forward. And it's time to think anew on this. As Lincoln said, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise to the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew.